Like I say, the second most dangerous time in the conference. And we have three great speakers who will be speaking on standpoint, perspectives, and ethics in I/O. That's the category that I laboriously worked on to try to summarize what we thought was going on in these papers. So we'll hear from Anne Doyle, Zé Augusto Chavez Guimarães, and Patrick, is it Keelty? Thank you very much. And so let me do the introductions, and then we'll get along with the doggies. Anne Doyle is head of the Huehua Library, First Nations House of Learning at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. Her research interests are in knowledge organization, Indigenous knowledge organization, and her dissertation, supervised by Joanne Archibald, is called Naming, Claiming, and Recreating Indigenous Knowledge Organization at the Cultural Interface. She'll be talking today about changing the stories we tell, the research ethic of Indigenous métissage. José Augusto Chavez Guimarães is a professor at São Paulo State University, UNESCO, Marília, Brazil. His co-authors are Juan Carlos Fernández Molina, professor at the University of Granada and Granada, Spain, and João Batista Ernesto de Moraes, associate professor at São Paulo State University, UNESCO, Marília in Brazil. And Zé will be speaking on ethical aspects in information organization and analysis of LAS education in the Mercosul arena. Zé is a professor at the university, as I said, and has served as chair of the Department of Information Science. He not only holds degrees in library science and communication science, but also in law. He has a passion for ethical approaches to information organization. His research interests are analysis of documents, organizational knowledge, epistemology of information science, ethics in information science, and legal documentation. And then finally, Patrick Keelty is a visiting assistant professor at the School of Information Sciences, University of Pittsburgh. He'll be speaking on sexual boundaries and social disappropriation. At the university, his writing examines and critiques knowledge structures, digital culture, digital humanities, gender and sexuality, intersectionality, and science and technology studies. With Rebecca Hong, he's co-editor of the Feminist and Queer Information Studies Reader, which is forthcoming. With Katie Shilton, he is currently co-editing Critical Information Studies. In addition, he's editing Gender and Sexual Boundaries and preparing a monograph entitled Seeking Sex, Embodiment, and Electronic Culture, which examines how the internet has reconstituted our ways of being sexual. His most recent essays have appeared in Knowledge Organization, Proceedings of the I Conference, and Interactions, and he's recently presented papers at the I Conference, the Society for Cinema and Media Studies, and Thinking Gender. Okay. So without further ado, I'd like to ask Anne to come up and give her talk, Changing the Stories We Tell, the Research Ethic of Indigenous Métissage. Anne?
Thanks, Joe.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me to speak at this conference. The protocol that I've been taught is to recognize the territory of the people who are visiting. So I'd like to acknowledge that the city of Milwaukee is located on the traditional territory of the original peoples of this area. The Menominee, the Fox, the South, the Potawatomi, the Ojibwe, and the Ho-Chunk people. This protocol, one might say, is part of an ethics of relationality, a recognition of the original peoples on this continent, of the histories and the legacies of those histories in this place where we stand, and of our interrelationships. And this is the central theme of the presentation that I'll give today, entitled, Changing the Stories We Tell, the Research Ethic of Indigenous Métissage. I used Indigenous métissage as the ethic for my doctoral study on Indigenous knowledge organization. The research problem really emerges from the small First Nations library where I work, which has outgrown its classification system and long ago has overwhelmed the A to Z structure for the subject headings, 130,000 subject headings. The existing universal classifications are widely recognized as inadequate for Indigenous representation. Representation of a large historic body of literature, great literature, and a burgeoning international, interdisciplinary Indigenous academic scholarship. So my research question is how can Indigenous approaches to knowledge shape knowledge organization theory for First Nations purposes. Just a note about abbreviation, I'll use the terms KO and KOS to stand for knowledge organization and knowledge organization systems. As part of my data, I conducted expert interviews with 9 Indigenous designers of KOS from 4 countries, and focus groups with a total of 9 graduate students at the university who identify as First Nations, Aboriginal, or Métis people. The purpose of the study is to develop a conceptual framework for the design of KOS for an Aboriginal academic library system. To do this, I assembled a meta-theory that I've used as for the conduct of the study itself, but it is also a conceptual framework or the theory for design. It's composed of an ontology, epistemology, called the cultural interface, which is an Indigenous theoretical location for examining intersections between knowledge systems by Martin Nakada, and the axiology of Indigenous Métissage by Dwayne Donald. Axiology may be defined as the philosophy of values. It covers a wide area of debate. For my purposes, I'm viewing axiological ethics as a focus on what is worth doing and what should be avoided. What is the ultimate purpose of research? The answers will include assumptions about the values that a theory might reflect or how it might contribute to society. Today, I'll discuss 3 ways in which the research ethic of Indigenous Métissage might shape knowledge organization theory. Indigenous Métissage is developed by First Nations educator Dwayne Donald for Indigenous education in Canada. It is grounded in the Indigenous ethic of relationality. Dwayne Donald is the descendant of the Papas Chase Cree people whose traditional territory is on the south side of the city of Edmonton in Alberta. The Cree lands were appropriated by the government of Canada in the 1880s. The Papas Chase people were dispersed. The maternal side of Dwayne Donald's family is Norwegian, and the Norwegian settlers moved into what was the traditional Papas Chase lands in Edmonton. So Donald grew up on that territory where his original ancestral people had come from, the First Nations people, and also his Norwegian mom. So this is part of a personal narrative of an individual scholar, but I'm looking at it as also a collective narrative of the country of Canada, and as part of the history and ongoing present in Canada. The term métissage derives from the Latin word mixtus, meaning mixed, that referred to a cloth of 2 different fabrics. The genealogy of métissage as a methodology reaches back to the notion of a bricoleur who creates a bricolage as an emergent response and a proffered solution to a real-world problem. It takes shape and it reforms as different perspectives and techniques are applied. Indigenous métissage is intended to be a counter-narrative with the potential to transform and to oppose naturalized, that is made to appear natural, ideas and dominant narratives. Sorry, I'm just learning how to use this. Thank you. Dwayne Donald uses the artifact of the fort as a mythic symbol and a site of inquiry into the dominant narrative that entrenches separation and difference between Aboriginal and Canadian people. In Canada, hundreds of cities and towns across the country have grown up at the site of the fort. The dominant narrative of the fort elides the relationality and the connectivity of people who have been living in the same place together for a long period of time. At the same time, the significance of these places for Aboriginal people is not the same as it is for most Canadians who are living there now. There are social, cultural, and spiritual aspects of the place that are part of an Indigenous cultural landscape. They are often mapped through stories, and Donald calls these place stories. The theme of place stories also emerged in the graduate student focus groups that I conducted. Here's a quote from one student. And I just feel like there needs to be recognition like that. It's all this stolenness that we spoke about. Everything was just stolen. Yeah, nobody knows the history. Nobody knows. It's like the history they're written about my hometown is of the people that came to develop the natural resources. So for Indigenous Métis-Sage, it has three aims. The first is to surface Indigenous stories of presence, participation, agency, and resistance. The second is to surface histories of interaction between Aboriginal people and Canadians. And thirdly, to critically examine the unequal power relations between them. An overarching goal is to repair the colonial narrative in Canada and create a more complex and reciprocal story. A central challenge is to contest the idea that the experiences of Aboriginal people are theirs alone and separate from the rest of the country. As an ethics, Indigenous Métis-Sage has a philosophical commitment that is based on an ecological understanding. It views human relations as relations with all beings or entities that inhabit the world. The environment is not separate from this complex web. It acknowledges how our histories and experiences are tied to in relation to each other and how our futures as people in the world are tied together. So, in the spirit of Indigenous Métis-Sage, I view the integration of theoretical approaches as a way of building bridges, specifically between Indigenous theory and knowledge organization theory. So when I think about building bridges, I'm looking at three pieces, or three kinds of bridge: epistemic, methodological, and conceptual. The epistemic bridge examines the consequences of the fort as it is embodied in library classification systems. The methodological bridge looks at producing a blended methodology called domain analysis at the cultural interface. And the conceptual examines the concept of warrant, Egtal, Wisser, and Molson, in relation to building a theory of religious knowledge organization. One of the consequences of the fort, as it is embodied in the dominant KOS, is the continued representation of Indigenous peoples as extinct or remnants of the past. And the related problems of omission, marginalization, and erasure are widely documented in the library literature. Blake, Joseph, Lawson, V. Simpson, 2005. The Aboriginal graduate student participants in the focus groups connected the material dispossession of Indigenous lands and resources with the dispossession of Indigenous histories, memory, and knowledge. I suggest that the KOS continue these dispossessions through erasing Indigenous presence in library collections, through inadequate representation, and this has a collateral effect of theft of Indigenous knowledge held within those collections. Knowledge organization may be analyzed as educational infrastructure, using the concept of classification as infrastructure from Bauer Star, combined with the concept of hidden curriculum that's used in Indigenous critical pedagogy. To say that KO as an educational infrastructure eclipses Indigenous presence becomes embedded in pedagogical practice and curricular resources that reinforce and perpetuate stereotypic representation. These create barriers for Aboriginal learners and simultaneously shape the perceptions of all students, their instructors, and the larger general public. To the extent that universal KOS function as barriers to Aboriginal students and to Aboriginal scholarship within educational institutions such as the university, it may be possible to articulate institutional responsibility for addressing this issue. That is, it may be articulated as part of the institution's accountability to Indigenous education and to intercultural education to address the systemic disadvantaging of Aboriginal learners and Aboriginal scholarship resulting from library infrastructure. As Froman, 1994, points out, questions regarding the theoretical bases of KOS don't have purely epistemic answers because they raise political problems. He says, if the theoretical concepts we construct in KO theory are presented simply as competitors on an epistemic playing field, ruled by logic, truth, and verification, then the particularities of their social, political, and discursive contingencies are erased. Indigenous métissage extends Froman's argument to say that Indigenous theory changes the way in which we conceptualize epistemology. Epistemology can no longer exclude social and political dimensions. Epistemology as components of a theory of knowledge. Demonstration of validity does not need to meet the criteria of truth, claims of post-positivist science, but instead to demonstrate coherence, accountability, and internal consistency. It therefore requires of knowledge organization, firstly a methodology, and secondly a theory that articulates power relations and the social effects of knowledge organization as a discipline, as a theory, and as a product, that is an artifact. As regards methodology, a blended Indigenous methodology called domain analysis at the cultural interface was constructed as a way of conceptualizing knowledge domains that gives an account of competing discourses, power, and its social effects. Harland has observed that a discourse theoretic approach seems to be more adequate for analyzing biases in existing systems than for developing criteria for designing new ones. However, I suggest that an analytic that assumes that power and social effects are integral to knowledge organization theory is mandatory to Indigenous theory in this study. Domain analysis in information science is used to inform a conceptualization of a knowledge domain in order to design or improve its information systems. From the perspective of Indigenous theory, it offers strengths in that it views knowledge domains as a discourse community. It recognizes the contextual nature of knowledge. It has multiple competing paradigms within a domain, and it also is explicitly philosophical and offers epistemic pluralism. However, domain analysis is a realist approach, so that doesn't really jive with an interpretivist approach like Indigenous métissage. So I've adapted it to treat a knowledge domain within the cultural interface as more of an analytic category, a concept. It's like an entity that the researcher projects onto reality in order to create a framework for study. That's Phillips and Jorgensen. The question of delimiting a domain is therefore viewed as a strategic question. It depends on the aims of the resource. Discourses are understood as objects that the researcher constructs, rather than objects that exist preformed as entities in reality waiting to be mapped. Nonetheless, the researcher still must clearly articulate the rationale for the construction. And in the case of KOS, this will be informed by the designer's purpose and the purpose of the classification. Domain analysis at the cultural interface was used in the study to conduct 4 domain analyses. One of its key characteristics is that it locates a domain within a larger dimension of social practice. And this is to tie social practice, which enables the engagement of social theory to contribute to understanding power relations within a domain. So this type of theory I'm characterizing as constitutive theory. It aims to produce a framework of related concepts and logics within a social ontology that's intended to be interpretive. The empirical accounts that it produces are viewed as interpretations of research objects that have been constructed, and it ultimately is to be evaluated by the audience it serves as to the plausibility of its account. Indigenous métissage leads to to a conceptualization of knowledge organization that exceeds but does not exclude the classic objective of search and retrieval within information science, at Feinberg, 2007, to include indigenous purposes of social, political, and pedagogical levels. The idea of multiple purposes of KO leads to considering an expanded definition of warrant. Based on Beckhoff, Wisser, and Olson, it's a warrant that functions on multiple levels and is defined generally as justification for knowledge claims and decisions. It operates on 4 planes of work: epistemic, discursive, and social. This approach holds that the conceptual work that occurs on the epistemic, discursive, and social planes must precede the structural work of classification at a structural level. Otherwise, we carry implicit assumptions into the design. This is based on the work of Mai and Feinberg. Thus, these are 3 ways that Indigenous Métis-Sage influences knowledge organization theory in the areas of epistemic, methodological, and conceptual approaches. So the question is, why are we doing this? And I want to tell you a story about Herb George, who's a speaker for the Wet'suwet'en Nation in northern British Columbia. And they have been in a struggle for recognition in Canadian courts for many decades. And the people were really tired. It's been going on for a long time. And one of the chiefs was in the room, and he said to everybody that he wanted to remind them what they were doing. He said, what this is about is to put a new memory in the minds of our children. He said, we have to change the stories we tell so that the memory they have going out from this time will be good ones. So I suggest that Indigenous Métis-Sage agrees with Herb George that we have to change the stories we tell for all of our children. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Anne. And we'll do a discussion at the end as well with all 3. So next, Zay. We'll provide the next talk entitled Ethical Aspects in Information Organization, an analysis of LIS education in the Mercosur area.
Well, good afternoon. First of all, I would like to send my congratulations to the SOIS of UWM for promoting this conference, the 2nd edition of this conference. It's very important for us who are all involved in research and bioethics. It's so important for us having an academic space for discussing. So my deepest congratulations to Hope and to all the UWM team. Well, this paper, in fact, is one of the results of a joint research which was carried out between 2 universities, the São Paulo State University in Brazil and the University of Granada in Spain. Since 2002, we've been carrying out researches on IO ethics, more specifically on the question of ethical values and ethical problems in IO. And in this case, we tried to analyze the educational LIS environment in Mercosur, in what extent those IO ethical issues would be present or not in library information science education in Mercosur. So, the structure of these presentations is divided in 3 major parts. In the first part, some theoretical considerations of IO ethics, especially considering that in the last decade, the information science environment has worked a lot in terms of discussing ethical issues in IO. In a second part, is a tentative to characterize the library and information science education in the Mercosur region. Mercosur as not only as an economic group, an economic bloc, but mainly as a cultural group who is searching for a closer integration. And then trying to analyze in what extent IO ethics is present or not in the library information science education in Mercosur, based on two approaches. The first of one, trying to analyze how the code of ethics, the library code of ethics of the countries belonging to Mercosur, they have information on IO ethics. And the second question is try to analyze how the professors, the library information science professors in the Mercosur area, how do they think in terms of IO ethics? So the question of information organization ethics in the last decade, every time I read on this subject, I really love this subject, I can realize how rich is becoming the scientific literature in information science. And we can notice different approaches. One of the approaches comes from Dauber, from Van der Waals, South Africa, and from Siegel, from Germany, in order to attempt us about the ethics of indexing. I mean, the danger which can be involved in the ethical danger that can be involved in the practice of indexing. Another approach is the ethics of translating indexing languages, especially developed by Michelle Hudon from Montreal, when she tries to point out how serious is the question of translating indexing vocabulary. It's not a question of translating. When I talk about this, I always remember a noted Italian proverb, traditori traditori, translating is betraying. In this point, Michelle Hudon shows us that when we translate vocabulary, we should consider the cultural context, the cultural environment in which that vocabulary was arising. It means the domain itself. In France, Leblanc, Yarraud, they talk about the professional responsibility in representing information contents. And the French concern, it's much more devoted to the professional practice and how to deal with those questions, specifically in library codes of ethics. Well, the concept of cultural warrant as a partner, as a natural partner of the concept of cultural literary warrant, it's very well developed by Claire Bechtel. The Spanish concept of transcultural ethics of mediation from Garcia Gutierrez, when he tries to point out that organizing information is mediating information, and every mediation presupposes a cultural approach. The concept of power to name from Hope, when she points out that the bad and the good things that can come from this power that the information professional has at the moment of naming information, of representing information. Another concept from Denmark, from Tellefsen, the respect to knowledge domain. Here we have another approach. In one side we have the approach much more concerned on the user. Here we have another approach much more concerned on the knowledge domain itself. It means the domain which the document reflects. The ethics of descriptive catalog, and this is one of the only papers I have found on the ethics of the descriptive catalog itself, where Sheila Baer discusses the questions on determining the authorship, for instance, the ethical problems involved with determining authorships. And a tradition we have been developing in my university on trying to discuss the ethical values and the ethical problems which are embodied by I/O activities. When we talk about I/O practice, we should consider two dimensions at least. One dimension that we could talk a technical dimension, what means a set of procedures, a set of tools, and a set of products from these activities. But on the other side, we have a cultural dimension. A cultural dimension which involves values, what we could show an axiological level of I/O, professional duties, which are listed on code of ethics that we could name at the ontological level, and as a consequence, a set of commitments that I would say in those levels, a commitment to the information, an ethical commitment to the organization, to the user, to the profession, and to the profession himself or herself, when we talk about our own values in contrast to the subject of the document. In terms of ethics, when we try to discuss ethics and information organization, the literature points us some concepts that should be considered in discussing this question. The human action in society, and as a consequence, the human values. The rules referring to rights and duties for social life, then we have the axiological and the ontological dimension. The concept of good and correct action as a basis of the ethical discussion. The concept of obligation, virtue, freedom, rationality, and choice. But how those questions can occur in the I/O environment. So, the main research questions that led us were, are there specific issues, I mean specific contents, specific procedures required by I/O ethics education? And, in a narrower approach, how do those issues work in a specific environment, such as the library information schools in Mercosur area? Why Mercosur? For two reasons. One is an obvious reason, it's the region where I come from. But the main reason is that it's an economic group, an economic bloc, that since its very beginning decided to promote educational discussions, educational agreement, and specifically in library information science, for 2 decades, this group has been developing discussions on library information science education. We should remember that Mercosur was created more than 20 years ago, and the original members were Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay. Here we have a map of South America with members. But as a consequence of this group, it was created in '92 what we call the Educational Mercosur. But we do not stop at the education of Mercosur. In 1996, it was created the Library Information Science Educational Mercosur. What means the group of all the library, the undergraduate and graduate library and information science schools of the countries which belong to Mercosur that decided to be side by side in order to discuss their educational situations and their educational perspectives. So, one peculiarity in this group is that although Chile is not an official member of Mercosur, Chile decided to be together with all the other countries in order to enrich the discussions. And I could say that the participation of Chile is very important for the group. And since 2001, Bolivia decided to be an observing member. It's not a formal member, but has been participating of the meetings, of the conferences, in order to know how things are happening. Just to characterize the group, it's composed by 43 library information sciences schools, undergraduate and graduate. And in this group, we have 7 schools in Argentina, 2 in Chile, 32 in Brazil, 1 in Paraguay, and 1 in Uruguay. The discussion of library information science education in the Mercosur region has received a double approach. In one side, under the professional dimensions, what means the library associations of the country decided to establish groups for discussing how they could improve and how they could integrate, how they could compatibilize their library code of ethics. And on the other side, the library schools decided to promote events in order to discuss questions like curricular contents, educational procedures, research interaction, grants, and so on. And one thing that I think it's important to sign out is that this experience in Mercosur occurred, this educational experience in Mercosur occurred 3 years before the European Treaty of Bologna, which it's been carried out nowadays about a whole discussion of educational perspectives. This is an agenda of the meetings that have happened in Mercosur. So in the first meeting in Brazil, the discussion of the curricular areas, then the minimum contents, then the objectives and the size, the shape of the curricular structures, then the desirable competences and abilities, the pedagogical methods, the research perspectives, the professors and students' development strategies, the exchange and cooperation protocols, and now the group is starting a new route. It's re-evaluating its route. Specifically in the curricular areas, we will note that I/O is one curricular area in itself. We have 6 curricular areas, and one of them, the curricular area 2, is specifically I/O. But in terms of ethical issues, how do those things work in the Mercosur countries? In a first perspective, looking to the Library Code of Ethics, we will note that the situation is in a very, very beginning. We can find such a few things on these questions. For instance, in the Argentinian Code of Ethics, we'll note only those 3 information, that information materials cannot be excluded for reasons related to race, nationality, religion, or social or political points of view. This excluded, we could for extension think that indexing can, in a certain way, exclude a material. Another question, librarians must promote the diversity of information by means of documents under different points of view. And another point is the contents of the documents cannot be adulterated by the librarian. In Brazil, only this information, unfortunately. Librarians cannot intentionally adulterate the contents of a document when analyzing it.
5 minutes.
5 minutes. In Chile, librarians must provide the user with the diversity of ideological points of view. And in Uruguay, librarians must promote ethical actions during information processing and dissemination. Paraguay has no code of ethics. Talking about I/O education, so we decided to send a survey to 25 I/O professors. What was the criterion of selections? primarily university which offered both graduate and undergraduate levels. And we had 70% of answers. The question were, do you think the I.O. contests have an ethical dimension, and why? 2, what kind of ethical values and problems can be involved in I.O. professional activities? 3, does your I.O. pedagogical practice include discussions of ethical issues? If yes, how does it happen? And the results were, do you think if the I.O. contents have an ethical dimension? 100% said yes. But let's see what were the reasons. Because I.O. is not neutral, it presupposes decision making. I.O. involves information actions with political and ethical natures, what means consequence and responsibilities. I.O. prints ideological marks. I.O. acts in the limit between the search of the neutrality and the suitability to cultural and social values. I.O. presupposes equity and response to respect to difference, and I.O. contributes to the construction of citizenship. Sorry. What kind of ethical values can be involved? This is the set of values which receive, the most citation of the group. I should point out that the values which are in blue confirm a previous research that we presented in Montreal 2008, based on the literature of the area. In terms of problems, what kind of ethical problems can be involved? The same thing. The blue ones confirm the research from presented in Montreal, but we have some other ones. Does your I.O. pedagogical practice include discussions of ethical issues? 94.12% said yes. And the major of these responses were related to dialogical strategies. Discussions, debates, conference, and what kind of contents? The ethical responsibility of the indexer, the librarian as a decision-making agent, the ethical commitment to the access to information, the need to contextualize the indexing activities, and the need to overcome technological, political, and economic and cultural barriers. Okay. In a second group, a minority group, by means of exercising projects in order to identify conflicts of values between the librarian and the document, identify possible indexers' interpretation that transgress the subject boundaries of the documents, and to evaluate ethical aspects in indexing language. Our conclusions. We note that in a deontological universe, professional code of ethics, there is an incipient approach of ethical I.O. issues in terms of ethical commitment to the user, respect to the ideological and cultural diversity, and attempts to problems like exclusion or censorship. In the educational universe, we notice a clear perception, much clearer, I would say, not clear, a much clearer perception of the issues, perhaps because these professors are researchers, are much more in contact with the international literature. We note that the professional environment seems to have a more naive conception of I.O. If we could say naive, why we say naive? Because they simply state the concept of professional responsibility in a general way, and everything can be said in this general concept. The educational environment more deeply recognizes the ethical dimension of I.O., but unfortunately we do not notice the presence of I.O. ethics specifically in the Library Information Science School syllabus. And another conclusion is that considering the values and the problems, that more specifically the concepts of cultural warrant, Bechtel, cultural ethics of mediation from Garcia Gutierrez, and the power to name of also are confirmed, although not mentioned, in the answers of the group. This is a partial result of a bigger research, and I thank you for the audience.